together to hear Michal Biton teach Dreaming of Zion. And I just want to note for those of you who were yesterday, welcome back. And thank you so much to Temple Emanuel for being a presenting sponsor for our week of learning. We're on day 2. So in case I don't say it at the end, I hope you'll join us same time tomorrow for Donnie Siegel. But today, I want to thank you all for being here. To Temple Emanuel for being excellent partners, particularly Amy Klein, who's our board member and really a partner in everything. The Shalom Hartman Institute, as most of you know, is a pluralistic think tank and educational center for the Jewish people. For additional learning, please check out our podcast on our website, Identity Crisis and For Heaven's Sake. And you could look at our new Journal of Jewish Ideas sources. My name is Jenny Liss. You can always reach out to me. I'll be helping to facilitate this session with my colleague, Ariel Meiri, who's sitting actually next to me. We're thrilled to be in the office. And if you have any technical problems during the session, you definitely want to text Ariel because he's the one who can help you. If you have questions for Michal that you'd like to ask, then just text them to me because Michal is going to speak, and for the last 10 minutes or so, she'll take some questions and I'll be able to facilitate those questions once you send those to me. I think that other than that, you know that we're being recorded. If you don't want to be recorded, you can turn off your video, but I really hope most of you won't do that because it's definitely more fun for us and for our scholar if we can see you. We will post a link to the sources in the chat so you can follow along, although I believe Michal is also going to be sharing her screen. You can find out more about Michal by reading the bio linked at the bottom of the session page. And I think we're ready to begin. If I see Michal, do you see Michal? Because I don't see Michal, but I'm going to turn it over to her now.
Can everyone see me and hear me? Yeah? Okay, wonderful. So good to be here. Thank you for having me. I don't know if you remember, but I came in person to Temple Emanuel. I think it was about 5 years ago, 6 years ago. And we had an amazing session about questions of Jewish continuity. And it's really nice to continue our learning throughout the years, even if it's on Zoom. So I'm going to start with a story, actually, just share something that introduces the topic. When I was either 20 or 21, I can't recall exactly, but let's say 21. When I was 21 years old, I was the head counselor of a summer camp in Israel. This summer camp was called Counterpoint, and it was run by Yeshiva University college students. And we went to Dimona. Do we know where Dimona is? Yeah, I have to speak a little bit louder. Yes? Okay, thanks. Do folks know where the city Dimona is? Yeah, so it's in the periphery, right? So that means it's on the geographic periphery in Israel. It's also in the socioeconomic periphery. And we went and we did a summer camp there, taking a lot of young people from Dimona and helping do a summer camp for them, and really hoping to give them a good summer experience where they will learn English, learn different Jewish values, etc. And one of the things that was really interesting is that one day during that summer, we were supposed to take those kids to a day trip to Jerusalem. And many of us have been to Jerusalem. We're not there right now, we're over Zoom, but many of us have been to Jerusalem. But it happens to be that a lot of these teenagers who lived in Dimona in the periphery, they had never been to Jerusalem before. So we had to put together a whole program to introduce them to Jerusalem. And looking backwards, I want to tell you what it is that I did to introduce them to Jerusalem. I was trying to figure out what is a good pedagogical program to take these young teenagers, many of them from Moroccan Jewish backgrounds, some of them having Russian Jewish backgrounds, many of them from the periphery, all of them from the periphery, and bring them to Jerusalem. And the educational choice that I did was the following. And I have the notes to prove this. I actually decided to put together a whole trip of Jerusalem through different testimonials of rabbis in Jewish history who yearned for Jerusalem, who dreamed of the Holy Land. So I literally took them to the old city and I dressed up as Nachmanides, a rabbi from medieval Spain. And I told them about how much Nachmanides dreamed of Jerusalem and how he was able at the end of his life to go there. And then a couple of steps later, I dressed up as Rabbi Judah Levi, Rabbi Yehuda Levi. As you can hear, I really like Sephardic rabbis. And I introduced them to his poetry and his song. And I told them how much he dreamed and yearned to go to the Holy Land and how legend says he was able to go there only at the end of his life and at least touch the stones of Jerusalem. The reason that I'm sharing this with you, and I'm not sharing this anecdote with pride or as an example, because looking backwards, I actually wonder what was going through my mind. I had these young people who lived in Israel, who wanted to go to Jerusalem. And how did I think was the best way to expose them to Jerusalem? Through imaginaries, through yearning, through deep idealizations of the city. What could I have done instead? I could have actually taken them and asked them to meet the real Jerusalem. I could have asked them, how did your ancestors dream of Jerusalem? Was the Jerusalem or the Israel they encountered similar or the same as the one they dreamed of? What does it mean for you living in the periphery in Dimona, being in relationship to Jerusalem? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? Do you understand what I'm trying to put on the table here, what I did and what I could have done? The reason that I'm sharing this, again, it's not with pride or as an exemplar of what to do pedagogically, but actually because that anecdote has really stayed in my mind. And it's become a bit of a metaphor for what I think many of us in the North American Jewish community do. Let me put my thesis right now on the table. So I'm putting all my cards out so you know exactly what I think and what we're going to be talking about right now. I think that one of the trends that characterize American Jewish relationship with Israel, discourse about Israel, is that we often conceive of Israel in a way that it's an imaginary. Okay? Let me say that again. Very often, when we talk about Israel, when we debate, when we disagree, when we engage or disengage, when we fight, when we support, when we withdraw support, the Israel that we talk about, we often talk about it in a way that is actually divorced from the Israel on the ground. Is my thesis clear? Does it make sense what I'm saying? Just give me some notes. It's really helpful to feel over Zoom like we're talking to each other, right? And that is something that I would argue really characterizes so much of the discourse, education, communal language about Israel in the North American Jewish community. What I want to do today is as follows. So let me tell you the stages of our conversation and our learning. We're going to spend a little bit of time trying to tease out and understand what does it mean that we have this imaginary Israel. And I'm going to show historical layers of how this imaginary has been built up. Okay, so we're going to examine that. The second thing we're going to do, we're going to do, it's not going to be exhaustive, but we're going to do a bunch of things. Second thing we're going to do is we're going to take a step back and actually focus and ask ourselves, how do American Jews imagine Israel? Yeah, so we're going to zoom into our particular experience. The third thing we're going to do is I'm going to present one tool, one idea from many, but one idea of what can we do for those of us who want to try to transcend the imaginary and be in a fuller relationship with the real Israel. Okay? So that's what we're going to do today. And I'll say one more thing here before we jump in. A lot of what I'm going to share right now, some of these are ideas that I have been thinking about for a very long time. Part of that has to do with the fact that I am an immigrant and I have lived in many different countries. So I have grown up imagining places and then encountering them, if you will. So it's something that's very much part of who I am. And all of the disappointments that come when a place does not live up to its imaginary, and then the building of new relationships. It also has to do with my own scholarship. I'm a sociologist. So my research, my doctoral research and my current book project are on the Syrian Jewish community in Brooklyn. So I think a lot about what it means to encounter other cultures. So some of these have been ideas that I've been thinking about for a long time, but others are a little bit more fresh. And I want to just name this right now. These ideas felt much more urgent and significant to me in the past couple of months with the war in Israel and with the discourse in the American Jewish community. And I kept trying to understand, how do I diagnose this moment? What am I seeing in front of me? Right? How do I understand some of the shifts that are happening? And going a step further, what are possible ways forward? What can we do in reaction to them? All right. So that's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna start right now. I'm gonna share my screen, and like Jenny said, if anyone has any questions, I'm very happy to take them at the end. Let me share my screen. Give me 1 second. Let's hope this works. Um, Sorry, friends. Um, okay, let's share it now. All right. I think I need to change the view, right, that I have in front of me. Can you see this well? Yeah? Okay, good. Wonderful. So let's start with the first step, which is going to be talking about Israel as an imaginary. I want to start introducing this idea with a rabbinic text. All right. So I'm going right now to this rabbinic text. And the rabbinic text introduces us to a binary. The rabbis here in the Talmud, and then we see it in other places, spoke, and they're going to focus on Jerusalem right now, but I'm using Jerusalem and Israel almost interchangeably. To me, they're both like imaginaries of the Holy Land. But when they speak about Jerusalem, the rabbis in the Talmud already concede that there are two Jerusalems. Okay? They already consider there are two Jerusalems. There is, I'm going to use the Hebrew for a second. There is Yerushalayim shel Mala, that's the heavenly, celestial, is that the right word? Celestial, using my own language, imagined Jerusalem. And there's Yerushalayim shel Mata, the earthy, earthbound, corporeal, everyday life Jerusalem. So in this passage from Ta'anit, from the Talmud, the rabbis are trying to figure out a verse from the prophet Hosea. And this verse is a little bit puzzling. And I'm going to jump around as I read. You can read the full thing, you have it in front of you. But they're trying to figure out a verse from Hosea in which God is saying through the prophet, I will be, it is sacred in your midst, and I will not enter the city. So the rabbis are trying to figure out, what is God saying here? If it's sacred in your midst amongst the Jewish people, why is God not going to enter the city? And they're trying to figure this out. And they give an interesting explanation. They say, when God says it is sacred in your midst, I will not enter the city, God is talking about the heavenly Jerusalem. And God is saying, I'll just read over here, I'm on the second paragraph, okay, the second line. The Holy One, blessed be he, said, I shall not enter Jerusalem above in heaven until I enter Jerusalem on earth down below at the time of the redemption, when it will be sacred in your midst. So the rabbis ask, so they have a question. Is there such a place as Jerusalem above? Like, what is the thing? It's like a new concept. So the Gemara answers, yes, as it is written, and they quote from Psalms, Jerusalem built up, a city unified together. The term, so Ir shechuvra la yachdav, it's unified. And they say the term unified indicates that there are two cities of Jerusalem, a heavenly one and an earthly one, which are bound together. I am bringing this here because we can mine again like rabbinic, traditional Jewish texts to help us understand that when we talk about Israel and about Jerusalem, that we have to distinguish between the Israel, the Jerusalem that we imagine, the heavenly one in rabbinic language, and the real one. And it's important to understand the distinction between them. I'm going to give right now three examples, three historical examples of the way that Israel or Jerusalem have been imagined. And what I'm trying to do here is actually to emphasize the fact that all of us in 21st century American Jewish communities, that we have inherited both a real Jerusalem, but we've also inherited um, thousands of years filled of yearnings and dreams and imaginings of Jerusalem. Okay? So let me go through some of these examples. The first example that I want to bring is just an example that characterizes what I described as Jewish exilic experience. So I bring here a very famous Tehillim, a very famous psalm, which is beautiful. And basically, It describes these Judean captives who are taken to exile by the Babylonians. And the Babylonians, and it describes how they're sitting in the rivers of Babylon and they are weeping when they remember Zion. And it says afterwards that their captors ask them to sing the songs of Zion. And they say, how can we sing of Zion being here in the rivers of Babylon? And it ends with the very famous verses, which we say in every single Jewish wedding. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I remember you not, if I set not Jerusalem above my chiefest joy. We all know this psalm. But what I want to emphasize here is that if we look at the verses carefully, we can begin to detect some of the psychological, if you want to call it, dynamics of what it means to have such a powerful yearning for a different place, to have this imaginary of the heavenly Jerusalem. Let me tease out two particular characteristics from this text. Characteristic number one is the following is that you sense, it's such a beautiful Tehillim, right? Such a beautiful psalm. You sense this yearning. And what you sense here also is that the yearning has become a yearning for an idealized Jerusalem. What do I mean by that? I'll give you a different example. My mom grew up in a place called Melilla. Melilla, it's a Spanish city, a Spanish province in Northern Africa. And I've never been there, but I grew up listening to her stories and her memories. And if you ask me to describe the place, I will describe a little paradise, okay? A place where everybody loves each other and people are friendly and people are relaxed and everything is beautiful. And of course, this has like probably nothing to do with the real space. But part of what happens when you have such powerful yearning is that you create a perfect sort of place, right? Your imaginary becomes idealized. And it's one of the things that we notice in this psalm. The second characteristic that we can notice from this exilic yearning is that the imagined Jerusalem becomes almost like a way to shape exilic identity. What do I mean by that? It's as if these Jews in Babylon say, how do we figure out who we are here in Babylon? And they say, you know how we do so? By remembering Jerusalem, by facing it 3 times a day when we pray and knowing that that's where it is. So it's almost like the building blocks of the imaginary. The imaginary gives you building blocks for your exilic identity. Does that make sense what I'm trying to say here? Does it feel a little bit familiar? Have we heard of Birthright Israel, for example? And the way that we talk about travel to Israel, yearning for Israel as something that helps us build American Jewish identity? Now, I'm going to actually go right now and read a text by Professor Jonathan Sarna that I think makes this absolutely clear when he talks about American Jewish identity. And he wrote this, I think it was in 1996. I have that written, 1996. But it helps understand a little bit um, what it means that Israel, Jerusalem have become imaginaries. And what Jonathan Sarna argues, and we'll read this momentarily, is he basically argues that American Jews at different moments were able to take this imaginary of Israel and they were able to use it for their own identities. And in order to be able to use it for their own identities, they had to imagine it in different ways. That's a little bit abstract, but he's going to explain to us in 1 second what that means. So let me read right now from Jonathan Sarna over here. Okay, let me begin with a bold thesis. The Israel of American Jews, the Zion that they imagined in their minds, dreamed about, and wrote about, was for centuries a mythical Zion, a Zion that reveals more about American Jewish ideals than about the realities of the land of Israel. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, American Jews depicted Israel as a holy land, a land where desperately poor and scrupulously faithful Jews engaged in prayer and study, a land, in short, where the material life values and practices of Jews were precisely the reverse of American Jews' own. What's he saying here? He's saying, and again, I'm not a historian of his caliber, but he's saying in this time, it served a purpose for American Jews to imagine Israel in almost the opposite way of who they were. Okay? Let's see how he continues going. And by the way, he doesn't get to our own time, so that might make us feel better or worse in him not continuing down all the decades. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, alongside this traditional image, a new one arose, the image of the romantic pioneer, the hardworking agricultural colonist, the brawny Jewish farmer, the answer, in other words, to those who claimed that Jews were mere parasites, racially incapable of productive labor. So, what's he saying here? When Jews are confronted with a new racial ideology that kind of grew roots in America in this time of heightened natalism and xenophobia, they're able to look at Israel and to imagine it and say, oh, look, that's where all the powerful, strong, hardworking Jewish farmers are, and actually be able to use Israel to argue back against American Jewish critics. All right? So again, Israel becomes an imaginary. It helps you figure out your own identity. Finally, in the second decade of the 20th century, Zionists like Louis D. Brandeis added a furthest twist to this image. Zion became for them a utopian extension of the American dream, a Jewish refuge where freedom, liberty, and social justice would reign supreme, an outpost of democracy that American Jews could legitimately, proudly, and patriotically champion. All these images, whatever truth they may have contained, took on mythic proportions in America. They embodied American Jews' yearnings and dreams, responded to their psychological, political, and emotional needs, and helped them to counter the malicious slurs of their enemies. The Zion of the American Jewish imagination, in short, became something of a fantasy land, a seductive heaven on earth where enemies were vanquished, guilt assuaged, I hope I'm saying that right, hopes realized, and deeply felt longings satisfied. Now, what Jonathan Stern is saying here, and I want us actually, and I'm speaking to myself also, when I first read this, my first instinct was to become a little bit defensive. It was to say, oh, they did that. I don't do this, right? I know the real Israel, and I've never imagined it in a way that has to do with my own dreams and nightmares. But the truth is, and I'll speak personally, I think that for me, even as someone who grew up reading about Israel, spending years in Israel, spending summers in Israel, I can still point to moments in which I encountered Israel in a new way that made me realize that my prior conception was an imaginary. I don't know if it's happened to anyone else here or if it's just me. I think it's happened to a lot of us. And I think it's something that we need to confront in a serious way when we're trying to think about American Jewish identity. Now let me go right now to trying to focus on this current moment in the American Jewish community. Because what I want to argue and I want to explore is that part of the work that we have to do when thinking about our discourse and when reimagining our relationship with Israel as a real country is try to understand both the imaginaries and also what I call the shattering of these imaginaries. Okay? Now, this let me bring like an example of what I mean by this. I don't know if it's happened to anyone here, but you always have this moment in human relationships, right? Think about a romantic relationship in which you have this imaginary of the person you dream of, you want to be with your partner, you idealize them, you're infatuated, and then there's moments when you realize, oh, this is not exactly there's a real person here. Don't tell my husband I just said this, okay? I'm still fully infatuated, he's my dream, whatever, he knows all this. But my point is, like, there's always that moment in which you kind of realize, oh, there's a person here, there's a living person here who's not my imaginary, my dream. And when you have to reconstruct and rebuild the relationship based on a real understanding of who this person is that goes beyond an imaginary that's a little bit of a projection that has to do with my own identity, more than with what the person in front of me is. What I want to tease out right now is that when we think about, let me just stop sharing for a second just to explain this. When we think about this moment in the American Jewish community, I think we have to put together a couple of puzzle pieces to diagnose these moments in light of imaginaries and broken dreams and what is going on right now. And what I think is important to realize is that American Jews, that we have to conceptualize our reality as one that is different from both the dreams and imaginaries of those who came before us who didn't have the sort of access that we have to Israel, right? Because we travel, right? We travel usually, Hartman's in Israel, and this we travel to Israel. We have social media. We read Haaretz in English. I mean, you don't have to go to Haaretz. The New York Times, so much of it is about Israel. We have we have familiarity with Israel, right? So there's something here that is different than the sort of dreams that we can talk about in the past of when you had an imagined Israel, but you knew that this was an Israel that you weren't familiar with. Is that clear what I'm trying to tease out here? That there's a difference between having an imagined Israel and knowing that it's imagined because you've never been there, okay? And having an imagined Israel that you understand through your American Jewish frame of reference, but because you've been to Israel or read about Israel, you feel like you know it. So you actually have the illusion of knowledge and familiarity, even while you still have an imagined Israel. That was a little bit abstract. Is that clear what I'm trying to put on the table right now? Okay. That is, I think, part of what helps us understand the current moment. That we still have this imagined mythical Israel, right? We have but we have certain familiarity. There's a lot of hyper focus on Israel in the media. There's some access to, especially in English, to Israel. So it's almost like many of us have convinced ourselves, yeah, we get Israel. We know exactly what kind of country it is. We know how to fix it. We know how to make it become the country it should be. We know better than Israelis themselves what it should be. We know exactly how to understand the conflict. You know what? Not only do we know Israel, it actually reminds us of America. We can understand and explain Israel through American terms and even through American conflicts. There's a psychologist who I love. His name is Eric Fromm. I don't know if anyone here read him. He has some like older kind of like writings. He also has a really good book on love called The Art of Loving. But I'm not going to talk about that right now. I just brought it up because I spoke before about infatuation and love. But he speaks a lot about the concept of alienation. And one of the things that he says, and it's in the slides if you want to look at it, but I'm just going to say it verbally. He talks about the fact that when you're in relationship with another person or another country, you have the idea of them and you have the person themselves. Does that make sense? Think about any relationship. You have the idea of the, and what ends up happening in an healthy situation is that as the person changes, because we all change, as I change and my partner changes, the conceptualization and the imaginary of the relationship will change also, right? That they become living things that change and evolve. But he says there's moments when you have alienation, when it's almost like the imaginary becomes divorced from what's underneath, from the reality, but you don't realize that. So again, let me just try to make it less abstract. So it's as if I keep imagining this person, even while this person keeps changing or is someone else, and I don't even realize that I'm talking about a mythical person or a mythical place. And that is arguably, and I am bringing right now a diagnosis. It's my own argument. So I actually welcome arguments back if you disagree with the thesis that I'm putting on the table. But part of what I think is really important for us to understand is that in the North American Jewish community, increasingly what we see is again this conceptualization of Israel in a way that is not always in relationship with the real Israel. And I would argue, and this, by the way, is a bipartisan statement. I'm making this across the board, right wing, left wing, pro Israel, anti Israel. Okay? I'm not discriminating against any group. I'm saying across the board, part of what we have is that we talk of Israel in a way that we often project our American questions into it and not always the real Israel. I'll give you one example, by the way. One of the things that I think a lot about that has to do with my own work. We all know, I mean, I don't know if we know, but uh, half of the Jewish population in Israel is Mizrahi Jews. These are Jews who come from the Middle East and North Africa. And one of the things that I have thought a lot about and done some work on is the fact that most Mizrahi intellectuals and most Mizrahi politicians and most of the big voices that lead Mizrahi communities, they talk and write in Hebrew. They don't talk and write in English. So I'm giving you one example. When I talk often when I teach and I ask people, what do we know about Mizrahi Jews? Half the Jewish population in Israel. This is not like a small thing. Half the Jewish population. And people very often don't have this sort of familiarity with it because, again, you don't have even like a translation of how to be able to access. So it's almost like we're looking at a country. We're imagining it in our own image through the English reports of mostly, let's say here, Ashkenazi American Olim to Israel, and and often without even realizing that we have a gap in understanding. Does that make sense? What I'm trying to put on the table? Yeah. Okay. Let me share a little bit more things to bring. Give me just one second. I have to open this again. Okay, great. I want to give you two examples of how Israel is imagined. And these are examples that are important to tease out and important to see them in light of each other. One example is that for many, and I'm inspired, by the way, by an article that Matti Friedman, a good friend of mine, wrote in The Atlantic. It's a very good article in which he talks about how American Jews have imagined Israel as America, basically. And one way, this is not exhaustive, but one way in which Americans and American Jews have thought about Israel is actually Israel as all that is holy and all that is good. What I mean to say by this is that very often there's been an idealization of Israel. Sometimes it's been a religious idealization. You can also think a lot about, like, Christian Zionists and the like. And sometimes the idealization has actually have to do with American patriotism. What I mean by this is that we hear people who describe Israel as like a mini America in the Middle East. And if America is the home of the brave, the land of the free, right? Then Israel is like a mini America, the most democratic country in the world in the Middle East. Give me some nods. Have we heard this sort of discourse talking about Israel? Yeah, okay. So I'll just read right now. This is something that Ruth Calderon wrote in 2004, and I thought it was a provocative description of this. She says, America chooses, she's talking about America, not just American Jews. America chooses to see Jerusalem as it was on the seventh day of the Six-Day War. So it's almost like there's something religious here. There's like a miraculous war, and we have the seventh day of that war. Although the media is full of images to the contrary, Americans are reluctant to let go of the dream of the heroic Jerusalem found in prayer books and Aggadot. Where is the view of present day Jerusalem, the hard scrabble city that is becoming ultra Orthodox, victimized by terror, a city full of poverty whose center is fighting for its life, devoid of citizens and tourists alike? America holds on to the old Jerusalem as a husband who sees in his aged wife only his youthful bride. If you look at the two pictures of the right, what I put here, and this again was inspired by Matti, a picture of the movie Exodus. I actually haven't watched it. I read the book, which was published in 1958. I know I have to catch up with all my required viewing. But this was from 1960, and Paul Newman was the hero of the story. And Matti Friedman, and he's not the first one to write this, there's been actually some scholarship on this, basically say, like, in these years, you basically have Israel reimagined as a place of like heroic American movie stars and actually having nothing to do with the real Israel. And it was a way to idealize and to love and to, it's like you fall in love with this mythical Israel of dreams. The second picture that I put below is a picture from I found like this rally of Christian Zionists, and you see there the American flag and the Israeli flag. And this is a motif that you see throughout in many spaces in which people basically say, and specifically from a patriotic place, we support America and we support Israel. They're the same. They have the same values, the same interests. They represent the same democracy. All of these things, by the way, are often expressed as the most potent pro Israel sentiment. And what I am highlighting here is that even in this kind of sentiment, it is mostly based on a heavenly Jerusalem. It is based on an idealized. Can everybody hear me? I'm seeing some. Yeah? Okay. You cannot hear me, Amy? Speak louder? Yes? Okay. It is based on an imagined, mythical Israel and not an Israel on the ground. And one of the things that I wonder, and I'm bringing it as a question, is how much does the positive idealization of Israel open the door or invite the opposite? Do you understand what I'm saying there? If so much of discourse and education and projections were based on a dream Israel, right? Could we maybe argue that that opens the door for a nightmare Israel? Do you understand what I'm saying here? That both of them are somewhat disconnected from the real Israel. They're in the realm of dreams and having to do with our American situation. Let me give you the second example. Second example will feel fresh because it's something that we saw a lot in the past couple of months. And I think, and I'll speak personally, it's something that I've been troubled by. And I've been trying to understand and ask myself, how do we respond to this? And part of what I believe is happening is that when we think about the West or America, and I know that I'm generalizing by putting them together, that in many parts of the West and or of America, you increasingly have a disillusionment with patriotism and with your own nationalism. So you have a disillusionment with your own American story. And then what happens if Israel was for decades held up as the symbol of all that's good about America? What happens if now, for many people, Israel then becomes the symbol, the dream, the imaginary of all that's bad about America? So you're basically taking the things that you don't like, that you hate, that you detest, that you want to fight about your country, and you're superimposing them on Israel. Does that make sense what I'm saying right now? I brought some examples that you have in front of you. You have a quote by Congresswoman Tlaib, who said, "What they're doing to the Palestinian people in Israel is what they continue to do to our Black brothers and sisters here in America, taking the racial, the need to fight racism in America and the racial conflict and supremacy in America and superimposing it on Israel, a country in the Middle East with very different populations, very different conflict." You see on the right a picture from a demonstration saying from Palestine to Ferguson, end racism now. And on the bottom, and I brought this picture because I had this visceral reaction to it because it was just like so, it was such a powerful example of what we're discussing right now. I don't know if it's too small to see, but I'll describe it. It's a picture of the Chicago Dyke March, and it says on the top, "Abolition Now." And you see a woman standing up on a burning police car and holding up two flags, the American flag and the Israeli flag, both of them up in flames. And there's something really powerful about this image because it's telling you all of the ways that you are fighting certain things in America. And again, I'm not saying that I'm agreeing with that I'm describing right now. You are superimposing that relationship into Israel. And it continues to be a mythical, a conceptual Israel. Let me pause for a second right now and just try to summarize a little bit before we introduce the last idea of our learning together. What I put on the table, and again, it's an argument. So you don't necessarily, I don't expect everybody to agree, but it's a diagnostic argument, right? Before we get to one idea, philosophical idea to help us think about it. What I argued is that um, for throughout history and in our rabbinic tradition and in our American Jewish history and in our diasporic Jewish history, that we always had two Israels, two Jerusalem. We had the imagined one, the site of all of our passions and yearnings and dreams and prayers. And we had the real one, a place that, by the way, we haven't discussed so much in this class, because really what I've been trying to do is disentangle the imagined from the real. And that is something that's part of our history, arguably part of the history of the West due to the and major civilizations due to Israel and Jerusalem being sacred sites for both Christianity and Islam. And it's something that really characterizes much of our experience. And then we zoomed in. And I said, we need to understand our current moment in the American Jewish community. in which we have some familiarity with Israel due to travel, due to media. At the same time, we continue to be in America and have an American frame of reference. So we continue to imagine Israel, project into it our American concepts, whether it's an America that we dream and adore and idealize, or an America that we demonize, that's part of what we're seeing, right? That we project it into Israel and that we don't necessarily recognize that we're doing this projection. And that is what I think is one of the most significant challenges that we have right now in terms of our communities. And it's a challenge that has many reasons behind it. I actually offered a question wondering if some pro Israel advocacy might have inadvertently contributed to this by kind of idealizing Israel in a way that has to do with more with the full idealization of American democracy than Israel as a different type of democracy in the Middle East that has very different characteristics. So right now, what I presented was trying to tease out the contours, right, of of the challenge that we have in terms of a relationship that is based on an imaginary. I want to present right now one idea. There's a lot of work to do on this, especially by the way, a lot of people. I work a lot with young professionals, with college students, and I think many people are nervous because the imaginaries that we have are shifting so rapidly, right? And maybe, and I'll speak personally here, maybe we are much more comfortable with some imaginaries than others, right? When we talk about Israel and a relationship to Israel. And what I want to propose is that some of the educational work that we have to do, some of the communal work that we have to do, and it's an intergenerational, transcommunal kind of work, is actually to figure out how do we um, how do we shift the balance more so that we have more of the real Israel. Okay. Now I was careful with my language. I didn't say how do we get rid of the imaginary. I personally don't think that's possible. I think that in every relationship, whether it's human, whether it's with a place, we're always going to have dreams. We're always going to have our aspirational image of what it could be. And they can be very powerful and they can help us. We can be in relationship to Israel because of the Israel we wish it could be. And we should keep that. And we should continue having our American values in a relationship to Israel. The problem is when we forget that there's a difference between the heavenly Jerusalem and the earthly Jerusalem. When we mistake one for the other, when we forget to do the translation, when we pretend that we know exactly what should happen, based again on an idealized Israel and not on an Israel on the ground. And I would argue that this can be deleterious. It can have negative effects. It can have negative effects for our own communal discourse when we have different parts of our community that have very different imaginaries, right? And when we project different American dreams and nightmares into Israel, it can be, and I would argue even like in a more concrete way, for those of us who actually see our job as being covenantal partners with Israel and the people of Israel, and trying to help Israel live up to its aspirational, Zionism and to all of the values that we hold so dear, that the way to help support and intervene, that the best way to do so is if we actually understand the right place. That when we have an imaginary, a projection of the place and not a real one, that's when our discourse, our interventions, our political activism can actually make things worse and not better on the ground. So there's a lot of work that we have to do. Let me share one idea, okay? And before I share this, it's going to be a theological idea, and I'm going to do it in a way that's going to be a bit quick. It's not going to give it the full breadth. We can spend years talking about this. But it's an idea that has been very powerful for me. And I'm going to just be very transparent. Even though it's a theological idea, I have used this idea. It's inspired me in the way that I think about people. So I'm actually taking theology and taking some ideas as to how we relate to God. And I'm going to argue that they can help us in the way that we think about how to relate to people who are different than us and specifically to Israel. Okay? Now, before I go to I want to share a text from Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed. Let me tell you, let me quote another psychologist. Actually, I think he's a pastor, not a psychologist, who influenced the way that I read Maimonides. So it's funny, I'm taking like, a contemporary relationship advice to read Maimonides to help us read Israel. Okay, so I'm kind of going different layers here. But has anyone heard of the book, The Five Love Languages? Have we heard of this book? Okay, I love this book. I really recommend it. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. Might not teach you so much about Israel, but I think it's a really good book for relationships, not only in terms of romantic relationships, but I think about it in terms of friendships, in terms of children, in terms of the basic premise by Gary Chapman. Sorry, I should have said that. The basic premise of this book feels obvious, but when you think about it, it gives us a deep philosophical message. What's the basic premise of this book? Jenny, if you forgive me, I'm going to use you as an example because your screen is right next to mine. The basic premise of this book is as follows. It says, let's say you have a relationship of two people. So, okay, you know what? I'm just going to use my husband. It's easier, Jenny. Sorry. Let's say like me and my husband. Okay, he allows me. I always ask him permission. I asked him for like a carte blanche kind of like permission to always use him. But so my husband's Sion. So the book basically says when you are in a relationship that you want to show love to the other person, you want to show them love. What are you gonna do? You're going to speak a love language. That's the idea of this book. And what's a love language? It's the way that you feel loved. Chapman argues there's five. You don't need to know this perfectly for Israel, so I'm going to say it quickly. Chapman argues there's five ways that individuals feel love. He says some people feel loved when they receive gifts. You could listen, by the way, and try to figure out who you are and who your partner or your friend or your child or your colleague or whatever is. Some people feel love through gifts. Other people feel love through physical touch. Other people feel love through quality time, spending time together. Other people feel love through words of affirmation when you say nice things to each other. Other people feel love through acts of service, like, oh, I made you coffee, I took out the garbage, I cleared up your desk at work. And what Chapman says is there's something that happens in human relationships that when we want to show love or understand someone else, there's a problem because we will often assume that the way we feel love is the way that they feel love. Okay? That the way, like, so let's say I love getting gifts. That makes me feel so good. So I'm gonna go to my child or my mom or whatever, and I'm gonna want to show them love. I'll be like, oh look, I bought you all these things. But what happens if what they need is not gifts? What they need instead is me to tell them how much I care about them. There's almost like a translation problem where you have good intentions, where you want to have relationship, but you're using the wrong categories to understand the other person and to understand what they need. And Chapman argues if you want to love someone, you got to learn their language. You got to take a step back. You got to understand who they are and what they need. You got to, and let me take it to a philosophical plane. I think that his work feels, it sounds simplistic. The idea sounds simple, oh, of course, but there's something very philosophical, deep here. It tells us that relationship demands the acknowledgement and the exploration of difference. It demands as a first step to say, you're different than me. You are not me. You experience the world differently. You are a different, you are like a totally different person. And part of what I need to do is understand both what we have in common and what we have different from each other. I'm going to share one text, and with this I'll conclude, and then we'll take questions in the last 5 minutes. The text that I'll share, and again, it's going to go a little bit to a different place than Chapman, but I'm sharing a text right now from Maimonides. Maimonides has a very, whoops, I'm in a different place. Okay, we see it over here. Maimonides has a theological outlook that, let me just warn you right now, it's a very difficult outlook. I don't take it personally. I'm talking as a person of faith right now. I don't take it as like a totalizing way for me to do theology or to pray to God or to relate to God. I take it as one of the building blocks of my own relationship with God and my own theology. But basically, what Maimonides says the following. Maimonides says, do you know how you can relate to God? do you know how you can actually have a relationship with God? He introduces the idea of what scholars will call apophatic theology or negative theology. What does this mean? You can read this inside if you want, but I'm just going to say it. Maimonides says, if you say, oh, God is like me, hence I'm going to worship God, hence I'm going to pray to God. Oh, God is powerful the way that I'm powerful, hence I'm going to be in relationship with God. Maimonides says, you're just projecting you into God. You're projecting your human self into God. And he actually advocates for a negative theology in which what you have to do is say, God is not like me. How do you achieve knowledge of God? By actually focusing on everything you don't know. God is not human. God is not like me. God does not have limitations. Do you understand what I'm trying to say here? It's a very deep philosophical concept, but it's a whole idea of negative theology. And I want to kind of like emphasize that this, if you take it to its extreme, it can be a little bit difficult to do theology this way, right? But there's a whole negative theology in which how do you relate to the ultimate other, which is God, by actually affirming that God is other, affirming that God is different, affirming how God is not like us. And Heschel, I'm going to go a couple of slides here. Heschel actually says, and I think Heschel's theology kind of takes Maimonides into account. Heschel says, when we relate to God, we have to avoid both. I'm going to use my own words for a second. Making God in our own image and also making God a full, total different other. Let me bring it down to our conversation as we sum up, and then we take some questions. The idea that I wanted to share here, and the reason that I brought Chapman and I brought Maimonides and I brought Heschel, is that when we talk about relationship, about the way that we relate to another, and again, you can go the theological route, you can go the individual route, you can go, and I want to apply to Israel. The part of the initial building blocks of the relationship has to be to ask, how is this other not like me? How is this other different than me? How is this, and again, thinking about Israel, how is Israel in the Middle East in a way that is not in America? How is Israel a mix of West and East in a way that is not America? How, and I'm talking right now about the Jewish population. How is Israel a combination of Mizrahi and Ashkenazi, proportion wise, in a way that is not America? How is Israel a mixture of secular Tel Aviv and devout Jerusalem in a way that is not? How is Israel a mixture of powerful and vulnerable in a way that? Do you understand what I'm saying here? That part of the building blocks of a relationship and part of what helps us, helps inoculate us against only having an imaginary Israel is to actually focus on a real Israel and to focus on the idea of difference. Not difference in a way that we become alienated or in a way that we become distant, but difference in a way that admits that any relationship, if you want to go to love, you can talk about love. If you want to talk about encounter, about relationship, about knowledge, that all of these things necessitate the ability to say, you are not me, I am not you. I cannot assume, if I assume that you are like me and that I'm going to project my needs, my dreams into you, I am not going to see you. I am not going to be able to be in relationship with you. So this is what I think is a part of the beginning of the building blocks of some of the work that we have to do in light of the imaginaries that really characterize so much of our relationship with Israel. So with this, I'm going to actually just turn it to Jenny if there's some questions.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So first of all, thank you. I'm gonna give you a couple of questions together, okay, and then you can handle them as you know with all the expertise I know you will. So someone you noted that and you used your husband as the way we idealize those around us and that we're in relationship with, and we have a question where somebody also noted, right? We do that with our kids, our grandchildren, even our own country, but we don't necessarily, or we haven't at this point, turned against them as publicly as American Jews have responded recently to Israel. So the question is that why is it so hard to treat Israel with the realities that we're all talking about now so differently than in other relationships? What is it that change or that what it evokes there? Okay. And the another question on this was um, was in terms of how does our philanthropic relationship with Israel as American Jews either factor in here or contribute to it? And then the last question was one in terms of something that you would, I'm going to throw this in there in case we run out of time. In case, and is there a book about like the real Israel, the real that has come out since Shavit's My Promised Land that you might recommend to Amcha here?
Okay, so great questions. I'm going to try to to address them in whatever way if I can. So the first question was about idealization, and I'll say it in my own words. Like we're seeing a rapture, at least I'm seeing, right, that we haven't seen before, and it's like, why can't we have a healthy shattering of the dream, the way we have in many human relationships, and we see people turning away? So I'll say a couple of things. Number one, I think that part of what this is my diagnostics, right? Part of what's happening is that we have in some parts of America people who are turning away from America as well. Does that make sense what I'm saying? That there are growing segments, let's just name it, of the progressive left, and especially amongst young people who, for a lot of reasons that I'm not going to get into right now, are disillusioned and turning away from America, as a concept, as something to be proud of. So very often you take that and you superimpose it upon Israel. So that's one thing. The other thing I would say is like this. I think that Israel has become like a larger than life concept that is very different than when you see somebody and you interact with them all the time. If you are in Israel all the time, like it's funny, there's actually been like a harsh critique in our, it's published maybe a couple of weeks ago. Sorry, I don't have it next to me, but we can send it later. Of some leftists in Israel who are talking to American leftists and who are like, join us in the real fight. Don't imagine Israel in a way that isn't real. There's so much work to do here. So I think there's something about distance, about not being there, that just makes it that there's something very seductive about dreaming about Israel. I would argue there's also like a way to avoid cognitive dissonance and a way to avoid some of the very difficult realities and conversations. Like if we're honest with ourselves, it's very hard. There's so many questions. It's very hard to think about Israel as a democracy, about the occupation, about the West Bank. It's very difficult. None of these things are easy. None of the work is easy, right? So I think there's something also seductive, like basically being able to say, well, it's just like America. And just like America can do like this and fix things, we can do the same thing with Israel. So it has to do a little bit, I think, with the culture wars, with the rise of kind of symbols, and with the fact that there's like a distance. And, yeah, as someone wrote, Nancy wrote, that there's something also about like the feeling of betrayal. That I think if you, I'll say it with my own words, I'm not saying Nancy said this, but I think if you've, and this goes back to your second question, Jenny, has the philanthropic ecosystem contributed to this? So I don't know enough about that, but I would say that when we talk about communal and pedagogical infrastructures, I think we've contributed to this. And I'll do my own mea culpa, right? I think when we've contributed to this by saying, Israel is the most, the epitome of democracy in the world and the most moral place in the world. And then it's not that, or there's such obvious difficult things. There's so much complexity. Then it's like when you're here, it's like you're going to fall, you're going to feel betrayed. And it might be easier to adopt a new imaginary than to actually have to grapple with the real Israel. The last question was about books to read and what I recommend. So I don't know if there's like one particular book that's come out. I'll tell you what, I'm not answering the question, but I'll say the following. And this is just a recommendation that I have when it comes to Israel, when it comes to American politics, when it comes to everything. I always say, and I'm bringing my sociological outlook to this. If you want to get to know another place, another community better, try to make sure that you're reading things that contradict each other. Find voices within that place that contradict each other. So whatever news you're reading, news outlets, whether it's Sahara, it's Times of, whatever. By the way, Hebrew is much better because you have access to much more. But at least in terms of English, try to make sure that you find conflicting voices. that is one of the ways, again, to inoculate ourselves against mythical conceptions, because you cannot have a mythical conception of a place once you are in relationship with people from there who are arguing against each other. That helps you understand that there's like real people on the ground arguing. So I always say this: you want to understand Mizrahim, you want to understand Palestinian, you want to understand Trump voters, Biden voters, wherever it is that you are, find people in those communities who are disagreeing with each other and giving different perspectives. And that will actually help kind of put like a guardrail almost against the sort of myth making, right? An idealization that allows the Jerusalem of heaven to kind of obscure our view of the earthly Jerusalem. So that's one recommendation that I can give in terms of how we we grapple and how we learn and how we continue moving forward in terms of our relationship.
Thank you, Michal. Thank you for even ending the way you did and validating the fact that there are probably different voices on this call, and that should inform how we continue our study and conversation. Thank you to everyone here, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow morning at the same time, same bat channel with a different scholar.
Bye, everyone.